The people of East Germany, after being restricted and oppressed, started a movement called the Peaceful Revolution. Shortly after the revolution grew enough, the government had to shift their tactics and allow the people to travel freely from the West, which caused the Berlin Wall to fall. This allowed Germany to be reformed and a unified country and move towards prosperity and success. After World War II ended in 1945, Europe was divided not only by borders, but also by ideology. The Western countries followed capitalism and democracy, while in the East, the Soviet Union spread communism. Germany became ground zero for this Cold War divide. West Germany was occupied by the Allied powers of Britain, France, and the United States, while East Germany was controlled by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was formed by the German Democratic Republic, or the GDR, to run East Germany. The capital city of Berlin was divided the same way, despite being located deep inside the Soviet-controlled zone. The Soviet-controlled East Berlin, which made up about 40% of the city, while the remaining 60% was controlled by the remaining Allied powers. Although the East German government promised equality and stability, many of the citizens were dissatisfied due to the poor living conditions, limited freedoms, and strict government controls. Between 1949 and 1961, nearly 3 million East Germans fled to the West. This amounted to roughly 20% of the East German population. This mass migration not only weakened their economy, but it was also an embarrassment to the communist government, showing that many citizens rejected their system. In an effort to secure its sovereignty, the GDR reacted by blocking the border. On August 13, 1961, the communist regime in East Germany began building a barrier between East and West Berlin. It began suddenly as East German soldiers rolled out barbed wire and tore up streets. Over time, these makeshift barriers were supplemented with armed guard towers, landmines, and the concrete Berlin Wall, which became the iconic symbol of the Cold War.
As the people on both sides of the barrier woke up on the morning of August 13th to their newly divided city, their initial reaction was shock and disbelief. East Berliners were suddenly cut off from West Berlin. Families had been divided overnight. What had once been a connected city became two separate worlds. West Berlin stood isolated, surrounded by Soviet-controlled territory. It didn't take long before the shock of those gathered at the border evolved into anger and desperation. In some areas where apartment buildings lined the border, people on the east attempted escape by jumping out of their windows to the west. When East German police began boarding up windows on lower floors, people climbed to higher floors to attempt escape. Throughout the 28-year life of the wall, there were over 5,000 recorded defection attempts. In early 1962, factory workers in East Berlin began building a huge tunnel that was 131 feet long. 29 people escaped before the tunnel was discovered by the authorities. Joachim Neumann, a West Berlin citizen, helped over 60 people escape through a secret tunnel he had spent months working on. One of the most successful tunnelers was Harry Seidel. Before his arrest by the Stasi in 1962, he managed to help over 100 people escape. A common method to escape East Berlin was to smuggle people under the engines of authorized cars to get them through the border. A common issue was that the smuggled passengers would get overheated and develop burns and blisters. To combat this, a group of East Berlin mechanics made a heat-resistant sheet to place under the engine that was thin enough for the passengers to fit under, but wide enough to block the heat. This design was credited for helping many East Berlin citizens defect. As people on both sides of the wall settled into their new realities, life evolved very different in the East and the West. Workers in East Berlin earned an average of 1,200 East German marks a month, while their counterparts in West Berlin earned 2,500. Shopping in East Berlin was difficult because they only had 10% of the items that the West had. Women stood in line an average of 2.5 hours per day to purchase needed food and supplies. In order to purchase a car, an East Berliner had to wait nearly 12 years. The socialist welfare that East Germany was so proud of gradually collapsed in the 1980s. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, the wall became a recurring subject in diplomatic negotiations. By the early 1980s, political pressure increased. Western European governments also intensified diplomatic coordination, emphasizing that the wall remained a central obstacle to long-term stability in Europe. The United States adopted a more confrontational stance towards the Soviet Union.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
By 1989, the German Democratic Republic was facing a crisis. Nearly 500,000 East Germans had already fled through neighboring countries after Hungary opened its border with Austria. This exodus exposed the regime's weakening control and intensified public frustration. East Germany's leadership insisted the socialist system was stable, but the numbers told a different story. In Leipzig, weekly prayers for peace at St. Nicholas Church began transforming into organized protests. Crowds grew massively in 1989, rising from a few hundred in early summer to more than 5,000 by September. Protesters demanded the right to travel, free elections, and an end to state surveillance. Wir sind das Volk, or We are the people, chanted by the crowds of protesters, directly challenged the government's claim to legitimacy. The state responded with pressure. The Stasi increased arrests, and the official media outlets denounced the demonstrations as criminal assemblies. But the movement only grew. On October 2nd, more than 20,000 people marched in Leipzig. Then came October 9th, the decisive moment. Roughly 70,000 citizens filled the streets of Leipzig in the largest unauthorized demonstration in GDR history. Although there were orders to stop the march, security forces did not intervene. Footage of this protest was recorded and smuggled into West Germany, where it would reach a worldwide audience, illustrating the weakness of the GDR and showing the world that the time for change was now. On October 18th, longtime leader Erich Honecker resigned under internal pressure. Demonstrations continued, culminating in nearly 500,000 people gathering in East Berlin on November 4th, the largest protest in GDR history. On November 9th, 1989, a miscommunication by Günter Schabowski triggered the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Within hours, thousands of East Berliners rushed to border crossings, demanding passage. Overwhelmed and lacking clear instructions, guards opened the checkpoints.
When the wall first fell on November 9, 1989, the overwhelming reaction of the people in the East was to flood the borders trying to cross just to see friends and family. Parties and celebrations started as people crossed from East Berlin to the West. Some even said that it was the greatest street party ever experienced, but the atmosphere soon turned from freedom to chaos and uncertainty. Within days, people began to take chunks out of the wall using hammers and crowbars as keepsakes. As they picked away at the wall more and more, it created unofficial crossing points. Attempts were made by East Berlin guards to funnel the flow through the official crossing points, but the revolutionary tide was too strong to stop. In March of 1990, the Allied countries, the Soviet Union, and both Germanys met in what became known as the 2+4 talks. On July 1, 1990, the GDR and the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, established a treaty that unified the countries economically. The GDR adopted the West German Deutschmark in order to join the European Economic Community. They signed a treaty on September the 12th that ended German occupation and unified Germany officially. As time went on, the people of Berlin experienced many difficulties. The wall had fallen, but it still stood, not in its physical form, but in the minds of the people. They were unified, but the past trauma that the wall had created still lived on in the people's psychology and lives. The Federal Parliament of Germany declared that, quote, "It is also the task of the state and society to remember the injustices of the GDR dictatorship and to commemorate the victims of communism in Germany. For years, behind the wall and the barbed wire, people suffered from lack of freedom, repression, and pressure to conform." Even today, policy and international law are influenced by the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was a pivotal moment that centered on human rights instead of political ideologies. From 1999 to 2020, many of the former members of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet bloc have joined NATO.